Hello. Hi everyone. I'm going to talk about the book Teaching What Really Happened. I don't know if you guys can actually read what it says because it might be backwards. It is on my end. So yeah, let's get into this book a little bit. The main premise of this book is it's almost like an anti-textbook. Textbooks are not really your friend in a history class. It kind of talks about how they're not even really written by the people whose names are printed on them. And they're kind of the reason a lot of students don't like history. Because they just kind of give like he describes it all the time as monotone throughout, so it's just kind of boring to read, and everything is presented as facts, and there's not really any evidence given. It's in the history profession, when we have a claim, we have to back it up with evidence, and it doesn't really go into that a lot in textbooks. So that's kind of the main premise of the entire book, but let's kind of break it up into different parts, because he breaks the book up into different parts. So the first part of the book is kind of like an overview. It goes into a lot of things. He talks a lot about the textbook things, why we shouldn't really trust our textbooks. But also he talks about a lot of stuff about kind of skills that your students will need to learn in a history class. He kind of goes into multicultural education as well, like why standardized tests are unfair for a lot of students, and things like that. One of the main things he teaches in the beginning of the book, and that's used throughout, is this idea of a forest. So you have your forest, which is kind of the entire subject, whatever it is, world history, U.S. history. And what you want to do is you want to pick, he says, 30 to 50 trees that you cover during this time. And he says there's going to be some things that you just can't find relevancy for, and that's okay, and you don't have to teach them. And so he says, it's going to be different for everybody. Maybe there's something you have no idea how to change and apply in that case, and so you can just leave it out. He says you don't want to go under 30 and you don't want to go over 50, so you should stay in that kind of range. I think he said his was around 36. Don't quote me on that. Basically, you pick your trees, and then he talks about what he calls twigs. In a history class, most general history classes and history books are just full of little twigs. And most teachers just kind of expect their students to pick up the twigs, and that's the entire class. So the twigs are just your kind of little factoids that really aren't important or relevant, don't build any skills. It's just like, can you recall who was the 15th president, and not important. And so part one, it begins with that, talking about your scope, talks about the multicultural education. Then he starts talking about the skills that your students need to learn. He talks about historiography and simply doing history. If we're getting into this, I think that there are a lot of strengths to this kind of teaching. So when we come to college and we take a history class, it's nothing like our high school history classes usually. And that can be a big shock for some students, especially those who aren't really going to go into history. And so if we teach them these skills, not only does it prepare them for college, but they're also important skills that students can take with them in their lives, So these kind of skills aren't just like for college. It's also kind of life skills, when you do history, and helps you learn why it's important, why we need to remember things, and how we can analyze how these things affect the world around us. So I think that's a really big strength about his book. If I had to critique it, I would say at some points it feels a little idealistic. He talks about all these great students that went out and did wonderful projects, and I'm not saying that can't happen, but it almost feels like sometimes he expects it to happen every single time. Some students are just going to take your class and hopefully pass and get out of there, is the way they see it. That doesn't have to be the case for everybody. Obviously, these stories are wonderful, and hopefully that does happen to a lot of students. But if there was a critique, I would have to give it that. One of the specific strengths of this book is that it gives like a structure to how to do these things, right? Sometimes we talk about how to make our history classes more relevant, and it just kind of turns into like a bunch of thoughts and theories. And he gives like specific instructions. How do you do this? Here's certain activities you can do. He talks a lot about local history, which is something really interesting. He said a good way to get your students involved is to have them go out and participate in local history. So figuring out, the role of certain events or people in your community, going to a graveyard, finding names, looking up names, figuring out who these people are, all kinds of interesting things. So I think it's really good in giving specific ideas for activities. If we're trying to talk about how this book can be applied to our understanding of a specific topic, it's actually really good because it goes into certain parts about U.S. history that are often confused or misinterpreted or mistaught in history classrooms. So the second half of the book, we talked all about the first half, which is a lot of the methods. Second half of the book kind of talks about how a lot of things get misconstrued in a history classroom. So he kind of starts out with the colonization of the United States, I guess you could say. So kind of with the misconceptions that are written and taught about the British and other settlers came over to the Americas and how that all came down. So that's the first part, and then he gets into other parts, talks about certain specific myths that are taught, that are kind of made to bring down Native Americans, such as the $24 myth, which is something I actually didn't learn at all in high school, side note. But basically, if you don't know, this is the idea that the Native Americans sold Long Island for $24 worth of beads. And he just kind of goes through and, deconstructs how it shows how that's fake. Also talks about things like slavery and the Confederacy, lost cause kind of narrative. How these things came about and why we still have discussions about them, why they're taught incorrectly in our schools. And finally ends with this idea of the Nadir race relations, which is something that isn't taught at all, but he explains the evidence for why it exists. So I'd say that's kind of how it contributes to our understanding of different topics, is it almost throws some of them on their head, right? And he talks about how to do history, showing your students that these things happen. To be specific to social studies teachers, this book is very useful, I think. It breaks down certain events and how to teach them correctly, but also gives ideas, lots of different ideas that you can do in your classroom. There's the whole chapter about doing history and historiography are full of great ideas that you can implement to try to teach your students. So I think it's very relevant. I think that's one of the big issues in our profession, is trying to find out how to get our students excited to do history. He shows statistics that say consistently students are saying history is their least favorite subject, which is kind of heartbreaking. But he says in classrooms where they implement the skills that he mentions, they really excel and really enjoy what they're doing. At the end of the day, I would say I absolutely do recommend this book. It's very insightful, and even if you don't agree with his teaching styles, I think misconceptions at the end in the second part of the book are very useful and important for history teachers to pick up on and understand, because there is a lot of falsehoods that are being taught and that our students are bringing with them, whether they hear them from the internet or their families or just in personal bias. You never know. And so I think that's really important, especially for history teachers to understand, to find out and pick up on. So I think it's a great read for anybody who's going to be a history teacher. I think we need to think more about these kinds of things that are in this book, and really learn how to teach our students to do history, not just tell them facts, for example.